everyone. Welcome. I've been wanting to have this conversation for a while now because there's a question that keeps coming up when I talk to engineering teams and platform leaders around AI. Everybody's moving fast, they're deploying models, they're connecting agents to tools and data. And at some point, someone in the room asks, okay, but how do we actually govern all of this at runtime? And then you get that uncomfortable silence. So today, we're going to dig into this question properly. I've got two great guests with me who I think are exactly the right people for this. Ikenna is the author of Automating API Delivery and an API Governance Consultant at Ikenna Consulting. He helps organizations figure out how to actually operationalize governance, not just talk about it. And he's been doing that in the API world long enough that he has seen patterns right now in AI that most people haven't caught up to yet. And then we have Emmanuel, who is the principal product manager here at Traefik Labs. Emmanuel has about 15 years under his belt. He's been an engineer, he's been a DevOps practitioner, he's operated at the C-level. So he brings this really grounded perspective where he can talk about what governance looks like in theory and then immediately tell you what would break when you try to ship it. And I'm your host, Sudeep Goswami, CEO of Traefik Labs. So let's get into this. We're going to start at the foundation. The phrase runtime governance gets thrown around a lot right now, but I find that different people mean very different things when they say it. So Ikenna, you have been in the governance space for a long time. How do you define runtime governance? And why does the word runtime specifically matter?
Thank you, Sudeep. Thank you, Sudeep. Yeah, it's, when we talk about governance, runtime governance, we're really talking about, what are those policies, what are those controls, what are those mechanisms that we've defined and that we're going to enforce on systems in production, systems in their operational phase. What are those controls? Whether it's around how we manage traffic, whether it's around how we secure those interactions, whether it's around how we observe and monitor it, what logs and things we capture, making sure that we have those policies that are enforced at runtime. Now, that's different from, say, design time, whether you're talking about design time for APIs or software, where usually, again, there's some sort of policies, but they are also checked at, before deployment. And so at runtime, it's more critical for organizations, you want to prevent any kind of failure or outage. And so runtime is really critical, and sometimes even more important than your design time, because you want that safe, reliable operating environments.
Great, great. Emmanuel, you are living this from the product side every day. Does that definition land for you? Or how would you add, maybe you want to add something to it from where you sit?
Yeah, thank you. So to me, running API or AI operations without runtime governance is like flying blind, style and minions all over in the cockpit. So the question is not if you will crash, but really when. And to me, the risks are so high, like breaking through the ceiling. And here, I mean, the security, the privacy aspect, input and output data related risks, financial and operational risks, like really, or even if you just think of the PR or the branding risks, you can easily end up in the news these days. But there are now frameworks, models, patterns, best practices, blueprints, however you call it. And you just really have to pay attention and use it. So to me, runtime governance is like a spectrum. Make it too strict and you make innovation impossible, or you can define clear boundaries that enable people. And as a matter of fact, not just people, but agents. The model we write about in this book that we are about to publish and sign it. Here we are using this same guiding principle, and we are composing these techniques that make it happen not just in theory, but really in practice, like infrastructure as code, GitOps, auditability, observability, gateway pattern, and so on.
Great. And I think that's a really useful grounding. Now, I want to pull on a thread that I think is one of the most underappreciated angles in this whole AI governance conversation. And Ikenna, you have written the 5 principles of API governance. We wrote an article some time back. So you have kind of seen this movie before in a different context. So how has runtime governance actually played out in the API world? And what parallels are you seeing now with AI and MCP starting to mature?
A great question, Sadiq. I think let's look at the history, right? So if we go back in history, when kind of with the launch of microservice architectures, and everyone was building all these microservices, and we saw those cross-cutting concerns. How do you expose the APIs of these services to external clients who are going to consume them? That was a problem. And you had in these services, you had obviously you need to write access controls on those services, authorization, authentication. You need to do all your monitoring and observability on those services. Again, those are cross-cutting concerns on the traffic flowing to the services. You need to do all your protection on against security protection on the services. And where you have that kind of architecture in that kind of space, if you don't have a central control point to do those things, to do those cross-cutting concerns, it's going to be very difficult to do, right? And so the gateway pattern kind of was introduced, and that just made it. Gateway pattern was introduced to just make it able for organizations to control, to have a single point of control, to put in that safety, to put in that security, that auditability, and all those good things at that layer. And that really progressed to having platforms, us building API platforms and having the speed and the efficiency which that delivers. And now we go to the AI. We're now living in an agentic world, and yes, we're having to build agentic applications. We need to interact with different LLMs. And again, we have the same problem, right? We have where different applications can be interacting with LLMs in their own way, maybe have their own direct connection to, again, those same questions arise. How do you manage those interactions centrally? How do you make sure that you have a consistent way of access? You are managing those credentials, again, all those cross-cutting concerns. And again, the gateway pattern comes to the rescue, right? And so we're seeing this, exactly to your point, Sudeep, we're seeing that pattern repeated, not just in the same kind of challenges, but roughly the same kind of solution pattern, right? Which is having a great proven gateway pattern that we know works from like an API governance perspective, using that to manage the interaction between applications and agents and the LLMs that they interact with. So yes, we've seen it again, and those great principles still work.
Awesome. Emmanuel, from where you are sitting building infrastructure for teams that are deploying these systems and these patterns, does that parallel that Ikena mentioned hold up in practice for you? What are you seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. To me, like, history is basically repeating itself, and we somehow seem to be not able to learn from our mistakes. And there is also the movement, like move fast and break things. And I myself remember previous organizations when I introduced Docker and Kubernetes and microservices architecture, and then composing APIs together and so on. Now, I remember back that what happened is APIs just proliferate, multiply by themselves almost. And what happened is that we had to centralize them, the management template, create templates, guides, define principles for development teams. And the very same is happening today with AI. Data science teams started experimenting with machine learning, but these days, basically everybody is using AI. And now one must really control it to avoid the imminent incoming damage. And ways to do it is you can run LLMs in-house if you are just thinking of AI in general, but that is costly, but that definitely eliminates the data residency issues. To move fast, instead of building like this infrastructure yourself, you could outsource that problem to third-party providers. But now you send your data to external locations, so that can be problematic for air-gapped or sovereign use cases. Also, if you want to play on the safe side, you can train custom models, but that is not that frequent from what I can see. But then it means that the model you are using probably knows really nothing about your specific use cases, your data, your customers, nothing. And now with MCP, Mobile Contracts Protocol, acting as the USB-C basically for context, data warehouses, your precious data stores are opening up your CRM system, and everything, your production database now has an MCP, and now the risk is even more high.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing more before we go on, Sudeep? Just something off the
Yeah,
back of what
please.
Emmanuel said. I mean, Emmanuel was talking about history, right? And different solutions implemented. Historically, one of the things I also noticed, see repeated is the the build it yourself pattern, right? So when we started with API governance and with API gateways, some organizations for various reasons decided to implement their own kind of API gateway, right? Perhaps they didn't have the exact gateways they wanted on the market at the time, or whatever reason, but they invested a lot of time and energy into building their own gateway, right? And obviously that involves a lot of cost and maintenance and things like that. And just from my talking with organizations as part of the research I did, which we're going to talk about later, is we find that again, even in the present interactions with LLMs, some organizations are building their own AI gateway, and there are use cases, there are specific needs where that's that is what they need. But again, it's just an example of where we're seeing the same patterns repeated, where it's always good to step back and say, what are the patterns out there that I can use? What are the perhaps solutions out there that I can use? Do I really want to commit to building my own solution and what that would involve? So I think these are some of the things that organizations need to think through as they build agentic applications and they interact with LLM.
Yeah, I love that framing because at least it tells us that the industry actually has a roadmap here. They're willing to kind of look back and learn, like from history, as you guys mentioned, before you look forward. So this brings us to something really exciting that we have put together, right? I think that's going to be really valuable for a lot of the teams watching today. So without further ado, I know Emmanuel kind of alluded to it. You also alluded to it. So, Kenna, tell us about this ebook that we have written called The Seven C's of AI Runtime Governance. Like, how did that come about? And like, who did you write this for? Who was the intended audience for this book?
Yeah, thanks. So when I started looking at this with, again, the rise of agentic applications and lots of people talking about AI gateways, I decided to spend some time to do some research and look at different solutions on the market, talk to organizations who were adopting AI gateways or were building generative AI applications, agentic applications without an AI gateway. I decided to talk to them and just hear from them kind of what were their experience, what was their experience with that, some challenges they were facing. And that really drove it. It was really, the driver was to hear from them to see what challenges organizations were facing with that. And what I did was to try and get all that into risks. I'm a consultant, and what I like to do is to organize things and conceptualize things and create models to help people reason about the problem, right? And so I thought about the different risks organizations face when they're building this. I framed it in this risk model I call the SOFA risk model, right? And there is talking about the SOFA there, S they're standing for the security and privacy risks that organizations face, whether it's around, credential leakage, sensitive data disclosure, prompt injection as you interact with those LLMs. What's the risk of an attacker sending prompts that can really malicious prompts into the system? And then we have the output risks in terms of output integrity and reliability. Is the LLM, maybe as a response to prompt injection, sending out some toxic content? Is it having hallucinations? In the book, which you've talked about, Sudeep, we really give examples of real life organizations that have faced real reputational risk because of the output of LLMs, right? And that's the O. And then we talk about the financial and operational risks around the costs. The cost of interacting with LLMs, they're not free, as we know, and also the reliability. And then finally, the A, there being the silo AI risks, where perhaps we have a platform team not talking to or an AI platform team not talking to the security team or things like that. So fractured audit trails, shadow AI, and things like that. And so that risk model is really the basis, and to help teams think about the applications they're building and how they can mitigate those risks. In response to those risks, we've kind of created this concept we call the 7 C's of runtime AI governance, and those are really that model is really the driver for that is really about mitigating these risks.
That's awesome. And I love how you approach this. You first did the research, you spoke to real users who are facing this, you came up with this risk model, as you mentioned, and then you addressed like how do you translate those risks into an operating model. So it's almost like the 7 C's becomes an operating model for AI runtime governance. So let's dig into that a little bit. If you can maybe just at a high level give our audience a taste for what are these 7 C's and how should people think about them?
Yeah, the concepts in the 7 C's all start with C. Surprise, surprise there. So the first one is control, right? And it's about, again, establishing a single point of entry for all LLM and agent, for all LLM interactions, right? How can we have that single point, that kind of gateway pattern again, to manage those LLM and agent interactions? The second C is about content, making sure that at runtime, we can enforce policies on the content in that LLM traffic. And the third C is about cost, which obviously is very important. How can we make sure we're tracking and optimizing consumption tasks? So we should do that, right? We should track and optimize our LLM consumption costs through some unified way again. And that AI gateways give us that central point of doing that cost control. The fourth C is clarity. And this talks about observability and monitoring, giving us that insight into production interactions, helping us debug issues, preferably doing that in a kind of standards compliant way. So that's about clarity, just getting clarity into our runtime operations. And then the fifth one is choice. So there are so many LLMs out there. I've lost count. I don't know about you guys, but I've lost count in terms of models. And there's so much great infrastructure out there on which they run on as well. But then we also, we have choice on which models we want to interact with, and we should be able to do that, right? We should be able to route to models we want to solve specific problems, maybe optimize for those problems, that are dependent, perhaps based on the prompt we're sending, we might want different models. So that choice is an important concept or principle. And then there's the code. Right? We want to make sure that whatever configuration we're using, again, these are lessons we've learned from API gateways, from platform engineering in general, is to use kind of configuration as code, use kind of a GitOps approach to make sure that we have, with our audit trails about every configuration change we do, and it's managed just the way we manage code using tools that teams are already familiar with. The 7th C, the final C, is about collaboration. How do we make sure that kind of the responsibilities are clear between all the different teams involved in managing those interactions, whether it's security, platform teams, whether it's GRC, governance risk compliance, in terms of audit, or LLM ops teams. How do we make sure that those AI API interactions, they're managed by all these teams, the responsibilities are clear, but we also have a good feedback loop, right? In learning from things in production and using that to improve the product. So that gives us, 7 solid concepts that we need to be thinking about. And I think why this is important is I know when I was doing my research and talking to some organizations, there were organizations that just were not aware of at the time that they needed to do this. They were not aware of an AI gateway. They were not aware of that these were risks that they need to be thinking of. In the book, I give examples of people who actually face real financial kind of shocks, because of the budgets that they were, or the costs that exceeded the budgets they had for their LLM interaction. So the idea is that we want to put this framework to help people think clearly about how they would mitigate those risks we talked about earlier.
Wow, that's a very comprehensive framework that you put together. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of things for practitioners to kind of dig into. So let me look at it from the practical side of things, right? And ask this question that I'm sure a lot of people watching this are thinking right now. If somebody's just getting started with AI governance, are all of these 7 Cs equally important and urgent? Or is there a sequence to this? Is there a place to start for them that would make more sense than trying to tackle all of these things, everything at once?
Yeah. So absolutely. So that's like how do I get started, with this kind of thing? And what I would say is always start with the risk first. I always approach these things risk first and think of, what are the risks that I'm facing? So I would actually say for listeners to start with a risk assessment. Look at your applications, look at your infrastructure. I've talked about that SOFA risk. SOFA, that's a model you can use to analyze your risk position. Are there security risks you think are more important, both in terms of the probability and then the impact if it occurs? Are there cost risks that you think you're more susceptible to, if I can actually pronounce the word? Then observability, everyone has to look at their own context, look at the risks that are kind of top for them. And there's a prioritization of those risks that needs to happen. When that's done, and in response to that, then look at the 7 Cs, and say, in fact, in the book, we do give a checklist to help organizations like think through each C, like what do they need to do, okay, to mitigate those risks. So I'll say, do a risk assessment, then look at the 7 Cs, use our checklist in the book to look at what you should do next. Perhaps you might have some controls already in-house you could reuse. Perhaps there are new controls you need to bring in, but new control mechanisms. Starting with that risk assessment and then using the framework we've provided here in terms of the 7 Cs to think through that is a good way to start.
Fantastic. Fantastic. All right. So now we have the framework and we have this prioritization lens, as you mentioned, through the SOFA framework. Now let's get into the implementation side, because this is where a lot of the organizations are stuck or get stuck. I think the 7 Cs make a lot of conceptual sense, but deploying the AI runtime governance in a production environment is a different challenge entirely. So I'll turn to Emmanuel. You're closest to this. How do you think about operationalizing this? And then what would a real implementation look like?
Yeah, so in the book, we explain what's called the triple gate pattern. But before we look into that, I think let's step back one step and let's look at organizations in general. They either pursue the new shiny thing, like they are early adopters and go to the next upcoming new tool and adopt it as soon as possible, or wait a bit more or wait a lot. And this also reflects really how they select tools and vendors. And I've seen fragmented landscapes, like one tool per use case with totally different user experience. Even even sometimes multiple tools for the same use case. And I also see over centralization, like with behemoth monolithic tools that want to handle everything from email and office and firewall and really packaging everything. But I think the truth lies in the middle. I myself would prefer using a tool that covers their own area well, and also with the necessary depth of features rather than very narrow or very broad. The triple gate pattern itself says that you should use an AI or LLM gateway to secure the model traffic, an MCP gateway to secure the context, and an API gateway to secure and govern your backends. Because AI traffic is essentially API traffic. But how you protect each of these kinds really vary. How you apply governance, different practices, different guardrails, and so on. So in the book, we illustrate how you apply the governance through Traefik. What I think Traefik nails well is that you don't have to use different tools for AI, MCP, and API. It's one package, one binary, very lightweight, infrastructure as code tool with very similar UX in declarative configuration for all these three use cases. And once you get it, you can apply basically the same familiar configurations, no matter where you are running your infrastructure, let it be cloud, on-premises, edge, hybrid, air-gapped, virtual machine, Kubernetes, Nomad, and so on. And all of this is built on top of open source foundation with vendor neutral standards and with a huge community behind. But I don't want to give like a sales pitch here. I really ask you to see it yourself in the configuration through the examples we provide. And on a footnote, even when we finalize the draft of the book, so far we provide even more guardrails, even more options to create multi-layer routing and additional things, bridge environments, and so on. So, of course, the book is a nice collection of practices and rubrics, but it's also you have to keep yourself up to date through documentation and product releases, because this particular frontier AI is moving really fast. But the principles, the guiding principles are always the same.
I think you touch a really important point, which is, AI is moving really fast. And I think the principles, the guiding principles that's been laid out in the book and the risk model that's been laid out in the book, I think can be highly durable and can last for a long time.
Exactly.
While the AI primitives keep changing, the operating model and the risk model can be consistently applied for many, many, many years, hopefully. And we've seen the same parallel that you guys talked about in the API world. So this is really great. And this has been a great conversation. So thank you both. And I feel we have only just scratched the surface of where all this is going. As you mentioned, this is moving too fast. So before I close this out, I want to give each of you just a moment for any final thoughts and something you want to leave the audience with. Start with you, Kenna.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. So the thing I want to leave with the audience with is, get the ebook. We really spent a lot of time putting this together, and we hope it's valuable to you, first of all. And so we hope it's really valuable to you, and get it and use the tools and things we provide, look at the examples and things. And I hope it's really valuable to you as you build applications, as you build solutions as part of your work.
And thank you, Emmanuel.
Yeah, so I would really ask you to evaluate what matters to you more. On one side, there is UI ops and ClickOps, and on the other side, there is GitOps. When you build your runtime governance, try a simple experiment. Try creating your policies as Word documents or Confluence pages, or try creating it through CI/CD pipelines with constant checking to the applied configuration. Also applying a constant check on the data flow through the gateway with continuous monitoring in place. Then you can really ask yourself the question, which one is more effective on the long run? In the old PPT framework, the People Process Technology Framework, now I think it's the best time to be alive, because technology is here to help how you build processes to enable the people and ultimately your organization to thrive.
Great. Well, I want to thank both Ikenna and Emmanuel for this wonderful conversation. What I'm taking away from today is that runtime governance is not a constraint on AI adoption. It's actually what's going to make sustainable AI adoption possible. So the SOFA risk model and the Cs should give teams a very concrete framework to start from, and the implementation path. Starting with control and building from there means that you don't have to solve everything at once. And the parallel to the API world is the one I think a lot of teams are going to find useful. The industry spent years learning those patterns and those lessons the hard way. With AI, I think we have a real opportunity to apply them earlier in the curve. So for folks that want to go deeper, definitely get the ebook. It's going to be a great place to start. We're going to link it here. And if you want to see how Traefik implements these patterns in production, including the triple gate pattern and the control layer, head over to traefik.io. Thank you all for watching.
Thank you.